It started like any other day. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when a sleek black car pulled up to a quiet intersection in a small town. Inside sat a man dressed in a sharp suit, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He wasn't just any man, he was the U.S. Attorney General, one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. But at that moment, he was just another driver, waiting for the light to change. Out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A local cop, young and full of authority, pulled up behind him, stepping out with a swagger that suggested he had no idea who he was dealing with. The officer's hand hovered near his holster as he approached the car, his voice firm, almost aggressive. "License and registration," he demanded. The Attorney General calmly reached for his wallet, already sensing that something wasn't right. There was no traffic violation, no broken law, so why had he been stopped? "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The cop scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "I ask the questions here. Step out of the vehicle." The tension in the air thickened. A powerful government official, one of the top law enforcement officers in the nation, now found himself treated like a common suspect. And then, in a shocking turn, the officer reached for his gun, pointing it directly at the Attorney General. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows on the pavement. But what the officer didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because karma has a way of catching up with those who abuse their power. And in just a few moments, everything was about to change. The Attorney General froze, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. The cold stare of the officer, the tension in his grip. It was clear this wasn't just a routine stop. But why? What had triggered this extreme reaction? His mind raced through possibilities. Did the officer recognize him but choose to ignore it? Or was this just a case of unchecked power? The officer's finger twitched near the trigger, his jaw clenched tight. "I said, step out of the car, now." His voice was sharper this time, filled with impatience. With slow, deliberate movements, the Attorney General unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. As he stepped onto the pavement, he kept his hands visible, not wanting to escalate the situation further. He had spent years in courtrooms dealing with cases of misconduct and abuse of power, but standing there under the hard glare of flashing police lights, he was now living the kind of case he had prosecuted. The officer took a step closer, scanning him with suspicion. "Who do you think you are, driving around here like you own the place?" The Attorney General remained calm, carefully choosing his words. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. "Misunderstanding? You were driving suspiciously slow, like you were trying to hide something." That statement made no sense, and both men knew it. The Attorney General felt his pulse quicken. He had dealt with tough situations before, but this was different. Here, on this empty street, it was just the two of them. No courtroom, no cameras, no witnesses, just a badge, a gun, and an officer with something to prove. Then, in the distance, another pair of headlights appeared, creeping toward them. The officer's eyes flicked to the approaching car for a brief second, his grip on the gun tightening. The Attorney General saw his chance. He took a slow breath, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything. Because if this officer thought he could get away with this, he was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. The headlights in the distance grew brighter, casting long beams of light across the pavement. The Attorney General kept his breathing steady, his mind calculating every possible outcome. The officer, still gripping his gun, seemed torn, his authority teetering between reckless aggression and hesitation. Did he sense that something was off? That this wasn't going to be just another traffic stop he could control? The car approaching slowed as it neared, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. He shifted slightly, glancing over his shoulder. That split second was all the Attorney General needed to recognize something crucial. This officer was afraid. Not of him, but of something else. But what? The vehicle came to a complete stop a few yards away. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was older, dressed in casual clothes, but there was a presence about him, something authoritative without being aggressive. The officer stiffened at the sight of him. The Attorney General took it all in, sensing the dynamics at play. This wasn't just about an overzealous cop pulling over the wrong person. There was something deeper, an undercurrent of history between these two men. The older man took a few steps forward, his voice calm but firm. "Everything all right here, officer?" The officer hesitated, his grip on his weapon loosening slightly. "Just handling a situation, sir." But the confidence in his voice had thinned. The Attorney General glanced between the two men, piecing it together. The way the officer's stance had shifted, how his bravado had dimmed. This older man held some kind of influence over him. But was it enough? The air was thick with unspoken tension. The officer had backed himself into a corner, and now he had to decide: double down on his mistake or find a way out before things spiraled beyond his control. The Attorney General knew better than to make the first move. He had seen men like this before, prideful, reckless, desperate to hold on to power. And the scariest part, they never went down quietly. The silence between them stretched, thick with uncertainty. The officer's breathing had quickened, his grip still hovering near his weapon. The older man, now just a few steps away, held his gaze steady. "I think you should put that gun away," he said, his tone even but commanding. The Attorney General watched carefully. He could see the internal battle playing out in the officer's mind. If he backed down now, he would have to admit he had overstepped. But if he pushed forward, if he let pride cloud his judgment, this night could take a dangerous turn. A tense moment passed before the officer finally exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching before he slowly lowered his weapon. But his expression was still tense, still unwilling to admit fault. He was acting suspicious, the officer muttered, as if trying to justify his actions. The older man shook his head. "You know that's not true." The Attorney General was still standing near his car, his heart steady but his mind racing. He needed to know why this had happened. He had spent his career fighting injustice, but this was something different. A cop pulling his gun on the country's top legal official. There had to be more to it. Then, just as the tension seemed to ease, another set of lights appeared down the road. A second patrol car. The officer's expression darkened at the sight of it, his posture tightening again. The Attorney General caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. This wasn't backup. This was something else. The second police car pulled up beside them, its door swinging open before it had fully stopped. Another officer stepped out, older, more composed, but his gaze locked onto the younger officer with something between disappointment and warning. He glanced at the Attorney General, then back at his fellow officer. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he asked, his voice low and measured. The younger officer didn't respond. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. And in that moment, the Attorney General realized this wasn't just about one bad cop making a mistake. This was about something much bigger, something that had been brewing long before this night, and it was about to explode. The air was thick with unspoken tension as the second officer's words hung between them. The younger cop shifted uncomfortably, his face tightening as if he was bracing for something. The Attorney General, still standing by his car, could feel it. This was more than a mistake. There was history here, something tangled and unresolved. The second officer took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto the younger man. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice low but firm. "Do you realize what you've done?" The younger officer swallowed hard, but his defiance hadn't completely faded. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but the words felt weaker now, less certain. The Attorney General had seen enough courtroom dramas unfold to recognize the signs. This officer wasn't just acting on impulse. He had been waiting for a moment like this. But why? Then, the older officer turned his gaze toward the Attorney General. "Sir, I need to ask you something," he said carefully. "Have you been in this town before?" The question took him by surprise. Not recently, he answered, his mind already working through the possibilities. Why? The older officer exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He hesitated for just a moment before finally saying, "Because I don't think this was random." The younger cop stiffened at the words, his hands clenching at his sides. That reaction told the Attorney General everything he needed to know. His pulse quickened. "What he's saying?" he asked, already sensing the answer would change everything. The older officer's eyes flicked to the younger one before returning to him. "I think he knew exactly who you were before he even pulled you over." The younger cop's face hardened, but he said nothing. His silence was an answer in itself. The Attorney General felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just about an officer overstepping his authority. This was planned, a setup. But for what purpose? And just as he was about to press for answers, a voice crackled over the younger officer's radio. A name. His name. Someone else was watching, and suddenly the night felt a whole lot more dangerous. The radio crackled again, the voice on the other end sharp and urgent. "Do you have him?" The younger officer's expression turned rigid, his fingers hovering over the device as if debating whether to respond. The Attorney General felt a chill creep down his spine. Someone had been waiting for confirmation. Someone who knew exactly who he was and where he would be. This wasn't an accident. It was a trap. The older officer must have sensed it too because he took another step closer. "Who gave you orders, son?" His voice was low but carried weight. The younger officer didn't answer. Instead, he gritted his teeth and turned toward his patrol car, as if trying to escape the moment. But before he could move, the Attorney General spoke. "If you're in over your head, now is the time to say something, because whoever you're answering to, they won't protect you when this goes wrong." For the first time, hesitation cracked through the younger officer's tough exterior. His hands twitched at his sides, his eyes flicking between the Attorney General and the older officer. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. But before he could respond, the second officer lunged. In one swift motion, he grabbed the radio from the younger officer's hands and pressed the button himself. "Stand down," he barked into the speaker. "The situation is under control." Silence, then a click, and the radio went dead. The younger officer's face drained of color. He knew what that meant. Whoever was on the other end had just cut him loose. The Attorney General stepped forward. "Talk." The officer swallowed hard, his confidence completely shattered. "I." His voice broke, his shoulders slumping. "I was told to stop you, that you were digging into something you weren't supposed to." The Attorney General's mind raced. He had been working on several high-profile cases: corruption, organized crime, even law enforcement misconduct. Any one of them could be the reason behind this. But whoever was behind it had influence. Enough to pull strings, enough to turn cops into pawns. Before he could press further, the older officer's radio suddenly came to life. A single message, chilling in its simplicity. "Forget this happened." And just like that, the night's biggest question remained unanswered, because now the real fight was just beginning. The Attorney General stood still, his mind racing. The weight of the message on the radio lingered in the air. Asterisk, asterisk, forget this happened, asterisk, asterisk, but how could he? Someone had orchestrated this, someone powerful enough to pull the strings from the shadows. The younger officer looked shaken, his confidence completely gone. Whatever he had been promised, it was clear he had just realized the truth. He was nothing more than a disposable pawn. His eyes darted around, as if searching for a way out, but there wasn't one. The older officer, still holding the radio, studied him carefully before shaking his head. "You messed up, son, and now you know it." The Attorney General exhaled slowly. He had seen corruption before, hidden deals, whispered threats, but this was different. This wasn't just about one rogue cop or a bad decision. It was bigger. And the fact that someone had just told them to walk away meant that whoever was behind it still had control. He turned to the older officer. "Will you handle this?" The man nodded. "I'll make sure he answers for his part." Then, after a pause, he added, "But be careful. If they're watching you this closely, they won't stop here." The Attorney General nodded, knowing the fight wasn't over. But this wasn't the time or place to push further. He had what he needed, a confirmation that there were forces working against him. Now, he just had to figure out who they were. Without another word, he stepped back into his car. The tension was still thick, but the moment had passed. As he pulled away from the flashing lights and the two officers standing in his rearview mirror, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because someone out there thought they could silence him. And they were about to learn just how wrong they were.